Hey guys! Tonight we're going to slow things down a little, dim the lights, maybe adjust your pillow, and wander into one of the strangest places in ancient history. So if you're tucked in, comfortable, and ready to drift somewhere quiet, let's begin. Tonight's destination is a lonely hill in what is now southeastern Turkey. A dry, sunburned landscape not far from the city of Sanliurfa. The hill itself is called Göbekli Tepe. And for thousands of years, it just sat there. A gentle mound of dirt and rock. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that screamed, world-changing archaeological discovery. Just a lump in the ground. Farmers walked over it. Sheep wandered across it. People occasionally picked up odd carved stones, shrugged, and went back to their day. Which, in hindsight, is kind of funny. Because beneath that quiet hill was something that absolutely should not exist. A gigantic, prehistoric temple complex, built around 11,000 years ago, which is awkward. Because according to the old version of history, humans at that time were supposed to be simple hunter-gatherers. No cities. No farming. Definitely no massive carved stone temples. And yet here we are. But before we get into that slightly uncomfortable contradiction, let's take things slow. Nice and slow. Because the story of Göbekli Tepe is not about one shocking moment. It's more like slowly realizing that the furniture in your house has been rearranged and nobody told you. So, let's start at the beginning. Or, at least, the beginning of the modern discovery. Which brings us to a German archaeologist named Klaus Schmidt. Now, archaeologists often spend years digging through layers of dirt hoping to find something interesting. Maybe a pottery shard. Maybe a broken tool. Schmidt, as it turned out, stumbled onto something a bit more dramatic. But the hill had actually been noticed before him. Back in the 1960s, a survey team from the University of Chicago and the Istanbul University looked at the site. They noticed stone fragments poking out of the soil. But they assumed it was a medieval cemetery, which, to be fair, was a reasonable guess. Ancient stone. Random hill. Nothing immediately obvious. So they logged it, shrugged politely, and moved on. And for about 30 more years, the hill continued doing absolutely nothing, which is impressive patience. Then, in the 1990s, Klaus Schmidt came along. Schmidt had spent years studying early Neolithic settlements in the region. And when he looked at the stones scattered across the surface of Göbekli Tepe, something about them bothered him. In the gentle, slightly annoying way that a puzzle piece bothers you when it doesn't quite fit. The stones weren't random. They looked carved. And not casually carved either. Carefully carved. Which was strange. Because the site dated back to a time when humans supposedly hadn't even invented pottery yet. Stone temples were not really on the menu. But Schmidt had a suspicion. So in 1995, he started digging. And slowly, very slowly, the hill began to give up its secrets. At first it was just fragments. Carved limestone blocks. Bits of sculpture. Animal shapes. Foxes, snakes, wild boar, vultures. Then came the pillars. And these were not small decorative pillars. These things were enormous. T-shaped limestone pillars, some weighing up to 20 tons. Carefully carved. Deliberately placed in circles. Some of them decorated with detailed relief carvings of animals. Others, oddly enough, seemed to represent human figures. Arms carved down the sides. Hands resting on a belly. But no faces. Just smooth stone tops. Which is slightly eerie. Not in a horror movie way. More in a calm, ancient, quietly mysterious way. Like the builders didn't want the statues to look directly at anyone. Or maybe they just ran out of time. It happens. Now here's where things get interesting. Radiocarbon dating showed that the site was built around 9,600 BC. That's about 11,600 years ago. For context, that's thousands of years before Stonehenge. And about 7,000 years before the Great Pyramid of Giza. Which is a pretty large time gap. It's like discovering someone built a space station during the Bronze Age. It doesn't quite fit the timeline, because at 9600 BC, humans were still hunter-gatherers. They were supposed to be living in small groups, moving seasonally, hunting gazelles, gathering wild grains, not organizing large labor forces to carve giant pillars out of limestone. But clearly somebody did. And they did it a lot, because Göbekli Tepe is not just one stone circle. There are dozens, many still buried underground, each one built around a pair of massive central pillars, surrounded by smaller pillars arranged in rings. Carefully planned, carefully built. And here's the slightly funny part. Nobody lived there. There are no houses, no kitchens, no garbage pits full of everyday trash, no evidence of a permanent settlement. It appears to be purely ceremonial, a gathering place, a temple complex, which raises a very relaxed but slightly uncomfortable question. Why would hunter-gatherers build a giant religious monument before they built cities? Because the traditional model of history says the opposite happened. First agriculture, then villages, then temples. Religion follows civilization. But Göbekli Tepe seems to say, actually maybe religion came first, which is a bit like realizing dessert was invented before dinner. Unexpected, but not impossible. Let's imagine the scene. Around 11,000 years ago, small groups of hunter-gatherers are roaming the region. The climate is warming after the last ice age. Wild wheat grows across the hills. Gazelle herds move through the plains. Life is manageable. Not luxurious, but manageable. And somewhere in this landscape, a group of people decides to carve enormous pillars, which would require hundreds of workers, stone cutters, transporters, organizers, food providers, all cooperating for years, maybe decades, without metal tools, without wheeled carts, without domesticated animals, just stone tools, rope, and patience, which honestly sounds exhausting. And yet they did it. The limestone for the pillars came from quarries just a few hundred meters away. Archaeologists have found partially carved pillars still attached to the bedrock. One unfinished pillar might have weighed 50 tons. Apparently the builders looked at that, paused, and collectively decided, actually that one might be a bit ambitious. So they left it there, which is relatable. Now when the pillars were finished, they had to be moved. Somehow, across rough terrain, into carefully dug circular enclosures, where they were set upright, perfectly balanced. The engineering is simple but effective. Stone sockets in the ground, packed earth, gravity doing the rest. But again, this required coordination, planning, leadership, which suggests a society that was more organized than we used to think. And that's where Göbekli Tepe starts quietly rearranging history. Because if hunter-gatherers could organize massive construction projects, then maybe early human societies were not as simple as we assumed. Maybe they gathered seasonally. Large groups meeting at sacred sites. Feasting. Rituals. Storytelling. Carving pillars decorated with the animals they saw around them. Foxes creeping through the grass. Snakes sliding across warm stones. Birds circling in wide skies. A stone memory of the world they lived in. And when the work was done, they didn't stay. They left, returning to their roaming lives, until the next gathering. And for centuries, maybe even millennia, this continued. New circles were built. Old ones were buried, which is another strange detail. The builders deliberately filled in their own temples, carefully covering them with earth and rubble, then building new ones on top, layer after layer, like quiet archaeological nesting dolls. Nobody is entirely sure why. Maybe rituals required closing old sacred spaces. Maybe beliefs changed. Or maybe they just like starting fresh. Humans do that sometimes. But the result is that Göbekli Tepe slowly became a mound, a layered archive of forgotten ceremonies, until eventually everyone forgot it was there, and the hill returned to silence for about 10,000 years, which is a very respectable nap. And when modern archaeologists finally began peeling back those layers, they realized something slightly humbling. Human civilization might not have started the way we thought. Farming may not have created religion. Religion might have helped create farming. Because if large groups of people gathered regularly at places like Göbekli Tepe, they would need reliable food supplies. Wild grain gathering might slowly turn into cultivation, which slowly turns into agriculture, which slowly turns into villages, which eventually become cities. So the first step towards civilization might not have been survival. It might have been belief, a shared idea, a shared ritual, a shared reason to gather on a quiet hill and carve enormous stones. And if that sounds slightly poetic, well, history occasionally allows itself a poetic moment. But we're not done here, because the carvings on those pillars, the strange animals, the mysterious symbols, the faceless stone figures standing silently in circles, they raise even more questions. Questions that archaeologists are still debating today. And as we slowly drift deeper into the story of Göbekli Tepe, we'll meet ancient hunters, stone carvers, Ice Age feasts, and a temple complex so old it quietly rewrites the opening chapters of human history. But don't worry. We'll take it slowly, very slowly. After all, the stones have been waiting 11,000 years. They're in no hurry. If you're still listening, hopefully you're comfortable. Maybe your room is a little darker now, and your brain has started drifting into that quiet, slow rhythm that late-night history tends to produce. So let's return to the wind-swept mound of Göbekli Tepe, sitting quietly in southeastern Turkey, not far from the modern city of Şanlıurfa. Because while the architecture of the site is impressive, the real personality of Göbekli Tepe lives in the carvings. And there are a lot of them. When archaeologists began brushing the dust away from the massive limestone pillars, they started noticing something curious. Animals. Everywhere. Not cute animals. Not friendly animals. Just animals. Snakes twist across the stone surfaces. Foxes trot along narrow ledges. Boars charge forward with stiff legs and stubborn expressions. There are vultures, spiders, cranes, scorpions, lions, and even a few creatures that look suspiciously like leopards. It's basically an Ice Age wildlife documentary, carved into limestone. And the detail is surprisingly good. These aren't crude doodles scratched with a rock. They're carefully sculpted reliefs. You can see muscles, posture, movement, which suggests that whoever carved them spent a lot of time observing animals. Which makes sense, because around 11,000 years ago, animals were everywhere. This region was part of a landscape archaeologists call the Fertile Crescent, a broad arc of land stretching across the Middle East where wild wheat, barley, and animals thrived after the last ice age. And the environment back then was slightly different than today. The climate was warmer than the ice age, but still cooler and wetter than modern southeastern Turkey. Grassy plains stretched between rolling hills. Seasonal rivers cut through the land. Wild herds roamed across open valleys. Gazelles, in particular, were everywhere. Huge herds, sometimes thousands moving together across the plains, which, for hunter-gatherers, was basically the prehistoric equivalent of a buffet that walked past your door once a year. Very convenient. Archaeologists digging at Göbekli Tepe have found piles of animal bones, especially gazelle bones, suggesting that large feasts happened there. Picture groups of hunters arriving at the hill, carrying freshly hunted game, lighting fires or roasting meat. Smoke drifting into the night sky. People gathering in circles, talking, laughing quietly. telling stories about hunts that probably got slightly more dramatic each time they were retold. Because humans have been exaggerating hunting stories for at least 11,000 years. Probably longer. Now here's where the animal carvings become interesting. The animals depicted at Göbekli Tepe are not the animals people were eating most often. Gazelles, the main food source, appear surprisingly rarely in the carvings. Instead, we see predators, foxes, snakes,
Scorpions.
creatures that bite, sting, or lurk quietly in tall grass, which suggests these animals had symbolic meaning, maybe spiritual meaning. And this is where interpretation gets tricky. Because Göbekli Tepe is so old, it predates writing by thousands of years. So the builders didn't leave us a helpful guidebook. No stone plaque saying, "Welcome to the sacred circle of the fox people,"
Which would have been nice.
Instead, we have to guess.
Carefully.
Patiently. Archaeologists have noticed that certain enclosures emphasize specific animals. One circle might have many snake carvings. Another features foxes repeatedly. Some researchers think these animals may represent clans or social groups, like ancient logos. Imagine different hunter groups gathering at the site, each group identifying with a particular animal. The fox people, the vulture people, the snake enthusiasts. You know, your typical prehistoric social clubs. Another idea is that these animals were connected to myths or stories. Perhaps each carving represented a character in ancient tales, heroes, tricksters, spirits. The fox in particular shows up a lot. And foxes are famously clever animals in folklore across many cultures, which makes it tempting to imagine that Ice Age storytellers were already telling fox trickster stories. Because humans really love clever animals in their myths. The carvings themselves also have a curious sense of motion. The animals are often shown walking or twisting across the pillars, not standing still, which makes the pillars feel alive, almost like a frozen moment in a story. A snake slithering upward, a boar charging forward, a vulture spreading its wings, all caught in stone. And then there are the vultures. Vultures appear in several carvings, sometimes quite prominently, which is interesting because vultures often appear in ancient burial rituals. In some early cultures, bodies were left exposed so birds could carry the soul skyward, a practice sometimes called sky burial. And in nearby prehistoric settlements, archaeologists have found skulls that were carefully removed from skeletons and displayed. Yes, ancient people had some very unusual decorating habits. Skulls were sometimes plastered, painted, or arranged in houses, which suggests that ancestor worship may have been important. So some researchers think the vultures at Göbekli Tepe might represent death rituals or spiritual journeys. Not in a scary way, more in a calm, symbolic, circle of life kind of way. Still, it adds a slightly mysterious vibe to the place. Imagine standing in one of the stone circles at night, torches flickering, the carved animals dancing in the shadows, foxes,
Snakes.
birds, huge silent pillars rising above you, and people gathered around performing rituals that we no longer understand. It must have been quite an atmosphere, peaceful but powerful. And then we have the pillars themselves, those tall T-shaped stones that dominate each enclosure. Some archaeologists believe these pillars represent human figures, very stylized humans. If you look closely, you can see carved arms running down the sides of some pillars, hands meeting near the front, almost like someone standing upright with their hands folded. But instead of heads, the top of the pillar forms a flat crossbar, which gives them that strange T-shape. It's possible the crossbar represents shoulders, or maybe a stylized head, or maybe the builders just like the shape. But if the pillars are humans, then the circles become even more interesting. Each enclosure has two giant central pillars surrounded by smaller ones. which could represent two important figures: leaders, ancestors,
Spirits.
standing in the middle of a gathering, watching, silent, stone witnesses to the rituals happening around them. Klaus Schmidt, the archaeologist who excavated the site for many years, believed these pillars represented powerful supernatural beings. Maybe gods, maybe mythic ancestors. He imagined Göbekli Tepe as a giant temple complex built to honor them. Other researchers are a bit more cautious. Archaeologists by nature are professional skeptics, which is understandable. If you spend your life digging up ancient trash piles, you tend to become careful about wild interpretations. But everyone agrees on one thing: Göbekli Tepe is not ordinary. And the more archaeologists study the carvings, the stranger it becomes. Some pillars include abstract symbols,
Lines. Dots.
shapes that might represent clothing or ornaments. One pillar even has a carved belt and loincloth, which suggests the pillars are definitely meant to be human-like. Fashionable prehistoric stone people, apparently. And occasionally, the carvings get a little weird. There are scenes that appear to show animals interacting in unusual ways. Snakes emerging from strange positions. Birds carrying objects. Figures that look half human, half animal. Nothing terrifying, just odd. Like glimpses of stories we no longer know how to read, which is one of the most fascinating parts of archaeology. Sometimes the evidence survives, but the meaning disappears. Imagine discovering a modern comic book 10,000 years from now, without any context. Future archaeologists might look at Spider-Man and conclude, clearly humans worshipped a spider deity who lived in tall buildings. Which, honestly, isn't that far off. Göbekli Tepe might be a similar situation. We're looking at symbols from a culture so ancient that the meaning is almost completely lost. But the carvings still feel intentional, purposeful, like a visual language waiting to be decoded. And archaeologists are still trying. But while researchers study the symbols and animals, another mystery sits quietly beneath the ground. Because most of Göbekli Tepe is still buried. Only a small portion of the site has been excavated. Ground-penetrating radar suggests there may be dozens more enclosures hidden under the hill. Dozens. Which means what we've seen so far might just be the beginning. A small glimpse of a much larger complex. A prehistoric gathering place that may have drawn people from across the region. Season after season. Year after year. For centuries. Maybe longer. And then, for reasons we still don't fully understand, the builders buried it all.
Carefully.
Deliberately. Covering the circles with tons of rubble and soil, like someone gently closing a book and walking away, which is a mystery we'll slowly wander into next. Because in Part 3, we'll explore the strange decision to bury Göbekli Tepe and the equally strange moment in history when humans quietly began inventing agriculture, which, as it turns out, might not be a coincidence at all. But for now, the stone animals remain where they've always been, silent, patient, waiting for someone to understand the stories carved into their backs. If you're still with me, hopefully you're comfortably drifting somewhere between curiosity and sleep. That's the sweet spot for this kind of story. So, let's slowly wander back to the ancient hill of Göbekli Tepe in southeastern Turkey, not far from the modern city of Şanlıurfa. A place where massive stone pillars stand in quiet circles, decorated with snakes, foxes, vultures, and all sorts of creatures that would definitely make your average Ice Age camper a little nervous at night. But the real puzzle isn't just the carvings. It's the people. Because the people who built Göbekli Tepe weren't supposed to exist, at least not like this. According to the traditional version of history that archaeologists believed for much of the 20th century, human civilization followed a very neat and tidy sequence. First came hunter-gatherers, small groups wandering across landscapes, hunting animals, gathering plants, moving when the seasons changed. Then someone invented farming. Agriculture allowed people to grow stable food supplies. That created villages. Villages turned into cities. Cities eventually built temples. Nice and orderly. History textbooks love that kind of structure. It's comforting, predictable. But Göbekli Tepe politely walks into the room, looks at that timeline, and gently flips the table over. Because here we have monumental temples built thousands of years before farming was fully established. Which raises a very calm but slightly awkward question. Why would wandering hunter-gatherers build giant religious monuments? And perhaps even more interesting, how did they feed everyone while doing it? Let's imagine a scene. Around 9600 BCE, small groups of people move through the hills and plains of what we now call the Fertile Crescent. They hunt gazelles. They gather wild grains. They collect nuts, berries, and roots. Life is mobile, flexible. People follow the seasons. But every so often, maybe once a year, groups begin drifting toward a familiar hill. The hill we now call Göbekli Tepe. Word spreads across the landscape. Maybe through trade networks. Maybe through simple tradition. People know it's time. So they gather. Families arrive from different valleys. Hunters bring meat. Gatherers bring wild grains and plants. And slowly, the quiet hill fills with people. Not thousands, but maybe hundreds. Which, in the prehistoric world, is already a very large crowd. Campfires appear. Tents or temporary shelters are built. Children run around. Dogs wander between cooking fires hoping someone drops a piece of roasted gazelle. And during these gatherings, work begins. Stone blocks are carved from nearby limestone quarries. Groups of workers haul the stones toward the hill. Others carve animal shapes into the pillars. Some prepare food. Others organize the placement of the pillars inside circular enclosures. The whole process would have taken months, maybe years. And that means something important.
Food.
Lots of it. You can't have hundreds of workers hauling 20-ton pillars if everyone is hungry. Which brings us to wild grain. The hills around Göbekli Tepe are naturally covered with a type of wild wheat called einkorn. And wild einkorn is actually quite productive. If you gather enough of it, you can grind it into flour, make simple bread, or porridge, or some early experimental form of prehistoric beer. And yes, archaeologists do believe alcohol might have played a role in these gatherings. Because humans have always been suspiciously enthusiastic about fermented beverages. Some researchers have even joked that religion and beer might have developed side by side, which, honestly, wouldn't be the strangest partnership in history. So during these gatherings, people collect huge amounts of wild grain. But here's where things slowly change. When you gather wild grain regularly from the same place, you start paying attention to how it grows. Which patches produce the most seeds? Which plants survive drought? Which areas produce the biggest harvest? And eventually someone has a thought. A very simple thought. What if we help the plants a little? Maybe they scatter seeds near the camp. Maybe they clear competing weeds. Maybe they water certain patches. Nothing dramatic. Just small adjustments. But those adjustments slowly begin to change the plants themselves. Wild wheat naturally drops its seeds when it ripens, which is great for the plant, but terrible for humans trying to harvest it, because the seeds fall all over the ground before you can collect them. But occasionally, by random mutation, a wheat plant holds onto its seeds. That plant is easier to harvest. So humans collect those seeds, plant them again, and slowly, over generations, the wheat changes. It becomes domesticated. A plant designed, unintentionally, by human preferences. And suddenly humans are farming, not because they sat down and invented agriculture in a dramatic moment, but because thousands of small choices slowly nudged nature in a new direction. Göbekli Tepe might have been one of the places where this process began. Not the only place, but an important one. A site where large gatherings required large food supplies, which encouraged experimentation with grain cultivation. And once farming begins, everything starts to change, because farming ties people to land. Hunters can move freely. Farmers, not so much. You have to stay near your crops, protect them, harvest them, store them, which leads to permanent settlements, villages, storage buildings, eventually cities. So, in a strange twist, the desire to build temples might have helped trigger the agricultural revolution. Religion first, farming second, which would mean that belief systems helped shape civilization itself. That's a pretty big role for a hill covered in mysterious stone pillars. But the story doesn't stop there, because Göbekli Tepe wasn't alone. Nearby sites show similar developments. One famous site is Catalhoyuk, a much later Neolithic settlement where thousands of people lived in tightly packed mud brick houses. By the time Catalhoyuk flourished, farming was fully established. People grew wheat and barley. They kept domesticated animals. And their houses were decorated with strange murals and plastered skulls because apparently prehistoric interior design was very bold. But the roots of that world may stretch back to places like Göbekli Tepe, early gathering sites where religion, ritual, and community brought people together long enough for agriculture to take hold. Of course, archaeologists still debate this idea. Some researchers argue that farming was already developing independently, and Göbekli Tepe was simply a ceremonial center used by early agricultural communities. Others believe the temple gatherings themselves drove the need for food production. The truth may lie somewhere in the middle. History is rarely simple, but one thing is clear. The builders of Göbekli Tepe were not primitive wanderers stumbling blindly through the world. They were organized, creative, capable of planning complex construction projects, capable of symbolic art, capable of coordinating large gatherings. In other words, they were very human, curious, social, a little mysterious, and perhaps slightly competitive when it came to carving the most impressive stone pillars. Because humans also love showing off. Now here's where the story takes another quiet turn. After centuries of activity, something strange happened. The people who built Göbekli Tepe began burying it. Not abandoning it suddenly. Not destroying it. Just filling it in. Stone circles were packed with rubble, soil, broken tools, and animal bones. Layer by layer.
Carefully.
Almost respectfully. Then new circles were built above the old ones. And eventually, even those were buried, until the entire site disappeared beneath a mound of earth, which slowly became the hill that farmers and shepherds walked across for thousands of years. A quiet hill, holding the memory of one of humanity's earliest monumental religious centers. But why bury it? That's one of the biggest mysteries. Maybe new beliefs replaced old ones. Maybe the site lost its importance as villages formed elsewhere. Or maybe the builders simply believed sacred spaces should be sealed once their purpose was complete. A ritual closing, like finishing a chapter. Whatever the reason, the burial preserved the site almost perfectly, protecting it from erosion, weather, and curious visitors for over 10 millennia. Which is why today archaeologists are still uncovering new enclosures, new carvings, new clues about a time when humans were just beginning to reshape the world. And in the next part, we'll drift into the strange personalities behind the excavation of Göbekli Tepe, including the passionate archaeologist who dedicated decades of his life to uncovering its secrets. Because the modern story of the site is almost as fascinating as the ancient one. And it involves dusty field camps, academic debates, and a man who spent years patiently peeling history out of a hill. By now the night is probably a little quieter. Maybe the room is darker. Maybe your brain has already begun drifting into that comfortable space where history turns into background scenery for sleep.
Perfect.
Because tonight's story is not just about ancient people carving pillars on a hill. It's also about the modern humans who slowly uncovered the place, one careful shovel of dirt at a time. And that story centers around one very patient archaeologist, a man named Klaus Schmidt. Now, archaeologists come in many varieties. Some are Indiana Jones types in movies, running dramatically through temples while things explode. Real archaeology, however, is a bit calmer. It mostly involves dust, measuring tapes, and long conversations about soil layers. Schmidt was very much the calm, thoughtful type. The kind of researcher who could stare at a piece of carved stone for half an hour and slowly nod like someone solving a quiet puzzle. Before arriving at Göbekli Tepe, Schmidt had spent years studying early Neolithic sites across southeastern Turkey. He was especially interested in the period when humans first began shifting from hunting and gathering towards settled life, which, as we mentioned earlier, is one of the most important transitions in human history. And also one of the slowest. Civilization didn't arrive overnight. It crept in quietly over centuries. A little farming here, a permanent house there, a few domesticated animals wandering around looking confused. Progress, but very gradual progress. So, when Schmidt first saw the scattered stones at Göbekli Tepe in the early 1990s, something immediately caught his attention. The carvings. Most prehistoric sites from that time period have simple tools, maybe a few rough stone structures. But these stones were different. They had animals carved into them. And not crude carvings either. Carefully shaped figures. Foxes. Snakes.
Birds. Boars.
Which suggested that the site was something special. Something ceremonial. Schmidt later said that the moment he saw the stones, he knew the hill was important. Very important. So in 1995, he began formal excavations with the support of the German Archaeological Institute and the Sanliurfa Museum. And this is where the slow magic of archaeology begins. Because uncovering a site like Göbekli Tepe is not a quick process. You can't just bring in bulldozers and start digging. Well, technically you could, but archaeologists would faint. Instead, the excavation happens centimeter by centimeter. Layers of soil are removed carefully. Every stone is documented. Every artifact is recorded. Every bone fragment is catalogued. It's a bit like solving a puzzle where most of the pieces are buried underground. And some of the pieces are very heavy. At Göbekli Tepe, the excavation team started by clearing the top of the mound. Soon the first stone circle emerged. Massive T-shaped pillars standing quietly in a ring, just as they had stood thousands of years ago, covered in carvings. Animals frozen in motion, arms carved down the sides of some pillars. And in the center, two enormous stones facing each other like silent giants. It must have been quite a moment. Imagine brushing away dirt and realizing you're the first person to see those carvings in 10,000 years. Not a bad day at work. But the surprises kept coming. Because as Schmidt's team continued digging, they discovered more circles. And more. Each one slightly different. Some larger. Some smaller. Some decorated heavily with animals. Others more minimal. And the deeper they dug, the older the circles became. Layer beneath layer. Like the hill was slowly revealing chapters of a very ancient book. Now here's something that makes Göbekli Tepe especially fascinating. Only a small percentage of the site has been excavated. Estimates suggest that more than 90% of the mound remains untouched, which means most of the temple complex is still buried, waiting. Schmidt himself believed that there could be dozens more stone enclosures hidden beneath the hill, possibly even hundreds of pillars still underground, which means future archaeologists will have plenty to do, assuming they bring comfortable hats and lots of patience. Now, while excavations were revealing the architecture of the site, another important task was dating the layers. To do this, archaeologists used radiocarbon dating on organic materials found in the soil, charcoal from ancient fires, animal bones, plant remains, and the results were surprising, very surprising. The earliest layers of Göbekli Tepe dated back to around 9,600 BC. That's the pre-pottery Neolithic period, a time when humans had not yet invented pottery, not yet fully domesticated plants, not yet built cities. Yet here stood monumental architecture, which meant historians had to rethink some very old assumptions. And historians, as you might imagine, can be a little cautious about rewriting the timeline of civilization. Academic debates began almost immediately. Some researchers suggested Göbekli Tepe might represent a rare gathering site used by multiple groups. Others argued that early farming communities must have existed nearby, even if their settlements haven't been found yet. And then there were the more imaginative theories. Because whenever an ancient site becomes famous, the internet gets involved. Some people suggested Göbekli Tepe proved the existence of lost advanced civilizations. Others proposed ancient aliens, because apparently aliens are very enthusiastic about carving limestone pillars. Archaeologists, however, tend to stick with simpler explanations. And the simplest explanation is this. Humans are capable of impressive things, even without advanced technology. Give a determined group of people enough time and they can move mountains. Or, at least carve very large stones. Schmidt himself believed Göbekli Tepe was the world's oldest known temple complex, a sacred center where hunter-gatherers gathered for rituals, feasts, and ceremonies. A place that may have helped bring communities together, which, as we discussed earlier, could have encouraged the early development of agriculture. But despite years of excavation, many questions remained. Why were the temples buried? Who exactly organized the construction? What stories did the animal carvings represent? And perhaps the most mysterious question of all, what did the people standing inside those circles believe? Because belief leaves very few traces in the archaeological record. You can find tools, buildings,
bones.
but beliefs live mostly in stories. And stories disappear when cultures fade away, which is why places like Göbekli Tepe feel so mysterious. We can see the architecture, but we can't hear the voices. We can see the carvings,
But we don't know the myths.
Still, the work continued. Year after year, Schmidt and his team returned to the hill each excavation season, mapping new structures, studying carvings, carefully removing soil that had rested quietly for 10,000 years. It became his life's work. And slowly, the site gained international attention. Documentaries were filmed, articles were written. Visitors began arriving in increasing numbers to see the strange pillars rising from the earth. Eventually, Göbekli Tepe was recognized globally as one of the most important archaeological discoveries of the modern era. In 2018, the site was added to the list of UNESCO World Heritage Sites, which means it is now officially protected as part of humanity's shared heritage. A quiet hill, now famous across the world. Sadly, Klaus Schmidt himself did not get to see all the future discoveries that will likely emerge from the site. He passed away in 2014, but his work transformed our understanding of early human civilization. And the hill he spent decades studying continues to reveal its secrets.
Slowly,
Patiently, just as it always has. Because archaeology is a long conversation with the past, and Göbekli Tepe has a lot left to say. In the next part, we'll drift deeper into the strange rituals that might have taken place inside the stone circles,
feasts,
symbolic animals, and the quiet spiritual world of people living just after the Ice Age. Because when hundreds of humans gather around giant carved pillars in the middle of nowhere, something important is probably happening. If you're still listening, hopefully the outside world has gotten a little quieter. Maybe the room is cool, the lights are low, and your brain is starting to drift somewhere pleasantly foggy. Perfect conditions for imagining life 11,000 years ago. So, let's return again to the quiet hill of Göbekli Tepe in southeastern Turkey, near the modern city of Şanlıurfa. Except this time, the hill isn't quiet. It's alive. Because tonight, people are gathering. You can imagine small groups arriving from different directions across the landscape. Hunters coming down from the hills. Families walking slowly across the plains. Children half running ahead, excited to reach the camp. The air smells like grass, dust, and distant fires. Dogs, the early companions of humans, weave between the travelers, occasionally stopping to investigate something interesting on the ground.
Which is usually a stick.
Or maybe an old bone. Dogs have always had simple hobbies. As the sun slowly sinks below the horizon, the hill begins filling with people. Dozens, maybe hundreds. For hunter-gatherers, this is a big gathering. Most of the year, groups probably lived in small bands of 20 or 30 people. But places like Göbekli Tepe might have brought many bands together at once. And when humans gather in large groups, interesting things tend to happen. Stories get shared. Songs get sung. Food gets cooked in ridiculous quantities. And someone inevitably claims they once wrestled a giant boar with their bare hands. Which, statistically speaking, probably didn't happen. But it makes for a good story. Fires are lit around the base of the hill. Hunters begin preparing the evening meal. Archaeologists have found enormous numbers of animal bones at the site, especially gazelle bones. Thousands of them, which suggests that big communal feasts were happening here. Imagine rows of roasting meat over open fires. The smell of cooked gazelle drifting into the cool night air. People grinding wild grains on stone slabs. Mixing them with water. Cooking simple flatbreads over hot stones. Maybe even fermenting grains into early forms of beer. Because humans discovered fermentation surprisingly early, and once we did, we never really stopped. So the gathering becomes a feast.
People eat, talk,
Laugh quietly. Children fall asleep near the fires. But eventually the focus shifts to the center of the hill, where the stone circles stand. The pillars rise from the ground like silent guardians. Tall, pale shapes glowing faintly in the firelight. Their carved animals seem almost alive as shadows move across the stone. Foxes stretch across one pillar. Snakes twist along another. Birds spread their wings across the limestone surface. The carvings flicker in the light of torches. And people gather around the circles. Now we move into the part of the story where archaeologists must rely on imagination. Because the physical evidence tells us what the structures look like, but not exactly what people did inside them. Still, we can make some careful guesses. Large ceremonial spaces like these were probably used for rituals. Maybe seasonal ceremonies tied to migrations of animals. Maybe spiritual gatherings honoring ancestors or supernatural forces. Or perhaps storytelling events where myths and traditions were passed down from generation to generation. Imagine a group entering one of the stone circles. The pillars tower above them, 20 feet tall. Massive blocks of limestone carved by human hands thousands of years ago. In the center stand the two tallest pillars, facing each other. Silent. Imposing. Some archaeologists believe these pillars represent human figures, perhaps ancestors, spirits, or mythic beings. If you look closely at some pillars, you can see carved arms running down their sides, hands resting on the front. One pillar even has a carved belt and loincloth, so they may represent stylized people, very large, very abstract people, standing in the center of the circle, watching. Now, imagine the torches. Firelight dancing across the carvings. The sound of voices echoing off stone. Someone begins telling a story. Maybe about the fox, a clever animal that appears again and again in the carvings. Maybe about the vulture, a bird that circles high above the land and carries spirits toward the sky. Or perhaps a myth about the creation of the world, told slowly, calmly, in the rhythm of a story repeated for generations. Stories were incredibly important in prehistoric societies. Without writing, memory becomes everything. Stories carry knowledge. Where animals migrate, when certain plants grow, how the world works. Stories also carry identity. Who we are, where we came from, why the fox is clever, why the snake should be respected, why the hill with the giant stone pillars matters. And so the people gathered inside Göbekli Tepe may have been listening to the oldest stories ever told. Stories that echoed off limestone walls long before cities existed, long before kings, long before written language. Just human voices telling human stories. Now imagine the stars above. Without modern lights, the night sky would have been dazzling. Thousands of stars. The Milky Way stretching across the darkness like a pale river. Some researchers have suggested that the layout of the pillars might even reflect astronomical observations, possibly aligning with certain stars or constellations. But this idea remains debated. Archaeologists are careful about claims involving ancient astronomy, mostly because humans have a habit of seeing star patterns everywhere once we start looking for them. Still, prehistoric people certainly observe the sky. The movement of stars can mark seasons, predict animal migrations, signal the best time to gather certain plants. So it wouldn't be surprising if the builders of Göbekli Tepe paid attention to the heavens. Maybe ceremonies here were timed with certain stars rising, or the changing seasons, or the migration of gazelle herds. The exact details are lost, but the rhythm of life likely shaped these gatherings.
Feast. Story.
Ritual.
Community.
And after the ceremonies end, people slowly drift back to their camps. Fires burn low. The hill grows quiet again. Tomorrow, more work may continue. Another pillar carved. Another enclosure expanded. Another gathering prepared for the next season. Year after year. Generation after generation. Until eventually something changes. The rituals stop. The builders begin filling the circles with stone and soil, carefully burying the pillars they once carved with such effort. And then they leave. The hill returns to silence. For thousands of years. But the story of Göbekli Tepe doesn't end there. Because the temple, by now the night is probably deep and quiet. Maybe the outside world has gone still. Maybe your mind has begun wandering in that pleasant half-awake state where history feels less like information and more like scenery passing by. So once again, we return to the lonely mound of Göbekli Tepe in southeastern Turkey, not far from the modern city of Şanlıurfa. But tonight we're going to slowly zoom out, because the hill didn't exist in isolation. It was part of a much larger world, a landscape filled with early communities quietly experimenting with new ways of living. Around 11,000 years ago, the region surrounding Göbekli Tepe was part of what archaeologists call the Fertile Crescent, which sounds very dramatic, but really just describes a large curved region of land stretching through parts of modern-day Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Israel, Jordan, and southeastern Turkey. The name fertile comes from the fact that the land was unusually rich with wild plants and animals. After the last ice age began fading away, the climate warmed slightly. Rainfall increased. Grasslands spread across the hills. Wild wheat and barley grew in thick patches. Animals like gazelle, wild cattle, and boar roamed the plains. In short, it was a pretty good place to live if you were a hunter-gatherer. Food was relatively abundant. Rivers and springs provided water. The seasons were predictable enough that people could follow familiar migration patterns. And because resources were plentiful, human populations slowly began increasing. More people, of course, means more interaction. Groups crossed paths more often. Trade networks developed. Ideas spread from one valley to another. And eventually some groups began experimenting with a radical concept: staying in one place. Now humans had occasionally settled in semi-permanent camps even before agriculture. But during this period, the scale of settlement began expanding. One fascinating example is the site of Jericho, located in the Jordan Valley near the Jordan River. Jericho is often described as one of the oldest continuously inhabited places on Earth. Archaeologists have found evidence of a settlement there dating back to around 9000 BC, which makes it astonishingly ancient. At early Jericho, people lived in small circular houses made from mud and stone. Simple structures, but permanent. A sign that humans were beginning to settle down. And then there's something even more curious. Jericho also had a stone wall and a large stone tower. Yes, the tower, built by people who technically hadn't even invented pottery yet. Which again reminds us that prehistoric humans were far more capable than older stereotypes suggested. They weren't just wandering around hoping to find berries. They could organize labor, plan construction projects, coordinate large groups. In other words, the building blocks of civilization were already appearing. And all across the Fertile Crescent, small communities were slowly testing the idea of permanent life. Some grew crops. Some continued hunting and gathering. Many probably did both. The transition from mobile life to farming life wasn't sudden. It was messy, gradual, a long experiment lasting thousands of years. Which brings us back to Göbekli Tepe, because it sits right in the middle of this transformation. A place where hunter-gatherers built monumental structures, while nearby communities were beginning to plant crops and build villages. It's almost like the old world and the new world overlapping. One foot still in the age of wandering hunters, the other stepping slowly towards settled civilization. And that overlap might explain why Göbekli Tepe existed at all. Because large gathering places become more important when communities are still scattered. If people live in distant camps most of the year, they need central places to meet. Places for trade, celebration, marriage alliances, and, of course, religion. A shared sacred site helps unite different groups. It gives people a common identity, which can be very useful when hundreds of humans are trying to cooperate without modern governments or written laws. So Göbekli Tepe might have been something like a prehistoric meeting ground, a neutral territory, a place where clans gathered seasonally to reinforce social ties. And during those gatherings, work continued on the massive stone circles. Which brings us to another interesting detail. Many of the stone tools found at the site were made from flint. Flint tools were incredibly sharp, perfect for carving limestone but also excellent for hunting. The presence of large numbers of tools suggests that the site wasn't just ceremonial. It was also a place of daily activity. People worked there, cooked there, lived there temporarily, which gives the whole site a slightly more human feeling. Not just a mysterious temple, but a lively gathering place, with cooking fires, tool workshops, children wandering around asking annoying questions, because every human society includes curious children asking questions. Probably questions like, why are we carving foxes on giant rocks? And somewhere an adult probably answered, because that's how we've always done it, which is a surprisingly common explanation throughout history. But here's another intriguing twist. Not far from Göbekli Tepe, archaeologists have discovered several other sites with similar characteristics. One of them is Karahan Tepe. Karahan Tepe also contains carved stone pillars and ceremonial structures, some even older than those at Göbekli Tepe, which suggests the region might have been filled with multiple ritual sites, a network of sacred places scattered across the hills, almost like an early spiritual landscape. Different communities might have visited different sites, each with its own traditions and symbols. And we're only just beginning to discover them, because archaeology moves slowly. Every excavation takes time, years, sometimes decades, and large portions of southeastern Turkey remain unexplored archaeologically, meaning there may be many more ancient sites hidden beneath the soil, sleeping quietly under farmland and hills, waiting for future archaeologists to stumble upon them, which is both exciting and slightly humbling, because it reminds us that our understanding of early human history is still incomplete. The story is still unfolding. New discoveries constantly reshape the timeline. And Göbekli Tepe is one of those discoveries that forced historians to rethink old assumptions. Before its excavation, most experts believed complex religious architecture appeared only after agriculture and permanent settlements. Now, the order might be reversed. Spiritual gatherings may have helped encourage the development of farming communities, which means belief, community, and storytelling could have played a direct role in the birth of civilization. Not a bad legacy for a hill covered in mysterious pillars. And yet, the builders of Göbekli Tepe eventually walked away from the site. They buried the circles, covered the carvings, and left the hill to the winds and grasses of Anatolia. No written record, no explanation, just silence. But that silence preserved something remarkable. Because today, as archaeologists slowly uncover more of the hill, we are glimpsing a moment when humans were still figuring things out. How to live together, how to shape landscapes, how to build meaning into stone. It's a gentle reminder that civilization didn't appear fully formed. It grew slowly, from gatherings around fires, from shared stories, from communities working together on projects far larger than any one person. And sometimes, those projects left behind stone circles that would sleep beneath the earth for 10,000 years. By now, the story of Göbekli Tepe has taken us through a lot of ancient territory. Giant stone pillars, early feasts, wandering hunter-gatherers slowly becoming farmers, and of course a hill that spent 10,000 years pretending to be just a hill. But tonight we're going to drift into one of the strangest mysteries of the site. Because eventually the people who built Göbekli Tepe decided to bury it, not abandon it, not destroy it, just gently fill it in. And that is a very unusual choice. Imagine spending decades, maybe generations, carving enormous stone pillars, hauling them uphill, arranging them into circles, decorating them with animals that probably held deep symbolic meaning. That's a huge investment of time and energy. And then one day someone apparently says something like, "All right, everyone, time to bury the temples," which must have been a slightly confusing staff meeting. Archaeologists discovered that many of the stone circles were deliberately packed with rubble, broken tools, soil, and animal bones. The material wasn't random wind-blown dirt. It was carefully placed, layer by layer, almost like the builders were intentionally sealing the structures. And they didn't do this just once. They did it repeatedly. Older circles were buried. New circles were built above them. Then those circles were buried too. Over centuries, the entire complex slowly disappeared beneath the ground, until eventually it became the quiet mound that farmers walked across for thousands of years. So naturally, archaeologists began asking the obvious question,
Why?
And the honest answer is, we don't fully know. But there are a few interesting possibilities. One idea is that the burial was part of a ritual process. Some ancient cultures believed sacred structures had life cycles, just like people. They were born, used, then eventually retired through ceremonial closure. In other words, Burying the temple might have been a way of respectfully ending its sacred function, a bit like sealing a time capsule. Except the capsule contains 20-foot limestone pillars. Another theory involves changing religious beliefs. Human cultures evolve constantly. The symbols and myths that feel meaningful in one generation can slowly fade in the next. Maybe the people of the region began shifting toward new forms of spirituality, different rituals, different sacred places. And when that happened, Göbekli Tepe may have been respectfully closed, not abandoned out of neglect, but intentionally retired. There's also a practical possibility. As farming expanded across the region, communities began settling in permanent villages. Large seasonal gatherings might have become less necessary. If everyone lives in nearby settlements year-round, the need for a central ritual hill becomes less important. Religion may have moved closer to home, into smaller shrines, into village life, into everyday routines, which again could explain why the giant ceremonial site was eventually buried. But here's another subtle detail that archaeologists noticed. The fill material inside the circles contains huge numbers of animal bones, gazelle bones in particular, thousands of them. This suggests that large feasts continued even during the burial phase, meaning the site was still active while the circles were being filled in, which leads to a slightly poetic idea. Maybe the final gatherings at Göbekli Tepe were farewell ceremonies, huge communal feasts where people celebrated the place one last time before sealing it beneath the earth. Imagine hundreds of people gathered around fires, cooking meat, sharing stories, walking through the stone circles that had been part of their culture for generations. And then slowly, they begin filling the spaces with stones and soil, covering the pillars, layer by layer, until the carvings disappear, until the circles vanish, until the hill becomes quiet again. It's almost like tucking the past gently into bed, which, honestly, feels appropriate for a story designed to help people fall asleep. Now, here's something else interesting. Because the burial process was so careful, it actually protected the structures. If the site had simply been abandoned, erosion might have destroyed the carvings. Wind and rain slowly wear away limestone. Animals wander through ruins. Plants push roots between stones. But the fill material acted like a protective blanket, shielding the pillars from the elements, preserving them for 10,000 years. Which means the decision to bury the temples, whatever the reason, accidentally turned Göbekli Tepe into one of the best preserved prehistoric sites on Earth. Sometimes the past survives precisely because someone chose to hide it. And that idea adds a certain quiet beauty to the story. Because somewhere around 8000 BC, long before pyramids or writing or kings, a group of people carefully sealed their sacred site underground, not knowing that one day, thousands of years later, archaeologists would slowly uncover it again. And people all over the world would listen to stories about it while trying to fall asleep. History has a funny way of working like that. Now, before we drift too far toward the end of our journey, there's one more piece of the Göbekli Tepe puzzle worth exploring. The animals. Because if you look closely at the pillars, animals appear everywhere. Foxes,
boars,
snakes, birds,
scorpions,
lions, even strange abstract creatures that archaeologists are still debating. Which raises another intriguing question. Why animals? Why carve so many creatures onto the pillars of what appears to be a religious site? One possibility is that these animals represented spiritual symbols. In many early cultures, animals carried deep mythological meanings. Foxes might represent cleverness. Birds might symbolize the soul or the sky. Snakes often represent transformation or danger. The carvings could reflect a belief system where humans and animals were closely connected, not separate from nature, but part of it. Another idea is that the carvings might represent clan symbols. Different groups visiting the site could have identified with different animals, sort of like ancient family emblems. So a pillar covered in foxes might represent one group, while another decorated with birds belonged to another clan. It's a theory that would fit well with the idea of Göbekli Tepe as a gathering place for multiple communities. But again, we can't know for sure. The carvings remain silent, their meanings lost somewhere in the long stretch of time between the Ice Age and today. Still, even without knowing the exact symbolism, the artwork itself tells us something important. The builders of Göbekli Tepe were artists. They cared about imagery, about storytelling through stone, about representing the animals that shared their world. And that artistic impulse feels very familiar, because humans have always decorated their environments. From cave paintings to temples, from medieval cathedrals to modern street murals. We like leaving visual traces of what matters to us, which means those ancient pillars are more than architecture. They're expressions of thought, of identity, of imagination, and perhaps of beliefs that once felt as real to those people as our beliefs feel to us today. Now, as we slowly approach the final stretch of this long, sleepy journey, the hill of Göbekli Tepe begins returning to silence. The rituals fade. The builders walk away. The temples disappear beneath the soil. Grass grows over the mound. Centuries pass. Then millennia. Empires rise and fall across the region. From ancient Mesopotamia to the Greeks to the Romans to the Ottoman Empire. And through all of it, the hill remains quiet, waiting patiently for someone to notice the strange stones hidden beneath the earth, which finally happened in the late 20th century, thanks to a curious archaeologist and a very stubborn hill that refused to keep its secrets forever. So let's drift back once more to the hill. The same hill, the same limestone plateau in what is now Göbekli Tepe, just outside the modern Turkish city of Sanliurfa. 10,000 years ago, the sun rises slowly over the dry landscape. A warm orange light slides across the ground. Dust drifts through the air. And somewhere nearby, people are waking up. Not farmers. Not city builders. Just humans. Still figuring things out. They stretch. They gather their tools. Someone starts a small fire. And eventually groups begin moving toward the hill. Because today, like many days before it, people are meeting there. Not to live, not to farm, not to build houses, but simply to gather. And strangely enough, that simple act might be the most important thing happening here. If you've spent any time reading about early human history, you've probably heard the usual order of events. First, humans invent agriculture. Then villages appear. Then temples and religion follow.
Nice. Clean.
Logical. But sites like Göbekli Tepe politely raise a hand and say, actually, what if it worked the other way around? What if the need to gather for rituals, ceremonies, or shared beliefs came first? What if religion, or at least communal gathering, pushed people toward agriculture instead of the other way around? It's a strange idea. But when archaeologists look at the evidence, it becomes harder to ignore. Because building these massive stone circles would have required something important.
People.
Lots of them. And not just for a single afternoon. These structures took serious labor. Quarrying limestone. Shaping pillars. Dragging them across the hill. Raising them upright. Carving animals. Organizing everything. That's not something a tiny wandering family group could easily pull off. It required coordination, planning,
Food.
and a reason strong enough to bring people back again and again. Imagine dozens, maybe hundreds of people arriving from different areas. Some from the nearby valleys, some from hills farther away, all slowly gathering at this sacred hilltop. They bring food. They bring tools. They bring stories. And maybe, just maybe, they bring shared beliefs. Because the carvings on those pillars are not random decorations. They repeat certain animals over and over. Foxes, snakes, wild boars, birds,
Scorpions.
it's almost like a symbolic language, or perhaps clan symbols, or spiritual creatures, or mythological beings. No one knows for sure. And honestly, that mystery is part of the charm. Now here's where things get interesting. Large gatherings require large amounts of food, and hunting alone might not always provide enough. So people begin experimenting. Maybe they start managing wild grains nearby. Maybe they harvest them more carefully. Maybe they plant some seeds intentionally. Not quite farming yet, but something close. Something experimental. And slowly, almost quietly, agriculture begins to appear in this region. Not far from Göbekli Tepe, around the same time, which has led some researchers to suggest something fascinating. Maybe people started cultivating crops partly because they needed reliable food for gatherings at places like this. Basically, religion might have accidentally invented farming, which is a very human kind of mistake. Hey, let's build a massive spiritual monument. Great idea. Wait, how do we feed everyone? Oh, guess we need agriculture now. And once farming starts, everything changes. Villages grow. Permanent homes appear. Animals get domesticated. Population increases. Social hierarchies slowly develop. Eventually, thousands of years later, full civilizations rise. Cities, empires,
Kings.
taxes, bureaucracy, and people complaining about paperwork. All the usual things. But it's possible that some small part of that massive chain reaction started here, at a quiet hilltop gathering place, with stone pillars, carved animals, and groups of humans meeting under the open sky. But here's another oddly peaceful detail. After centuries of activity, something unexpected happens. The site is buried, not destroyed, not abandoned in chaos, carefully buried. People fill the enclosures with dirt and debris, pillar by pillar, wall by wall, layer after layer, until the structures disappear beneath the ground. And this happens repeatedly. Older circles are filled in. New ones are built on top. Then those are filled too. Eventually the whole hill becomes a layered time capsule. And no one knows exactly why. Maybe they believed sacred places needed to be retired respectfully. Maybe rituals required renewal. Maybe they simply wanted to start fresh. Or maybe they were tidying up. 10,000 years ago, someone apparently believed in cleaning up after a construction project, which is honestly impressive. Whatever the reason, that burial process ended up protecting the site for millennia, hidden underground, safe from weather, safe from looters, safe from curious travelers, waiting quietly beneath the soil, until the 20th century, when archaeologists finally began to understand what was hiding here. One of the key figures in that story was Klaus Schmidt, who started major excavations in the 1990s. When he arrived, the hill looked pretty ordinary. A few scattered stones, some farming fields nearby. Nothing too dramatic. But once digging began, the truth slowly emerged. Massive carved pillars,
Circular temples.
animal reliefs, and the realization that this site was far older than expected. Much older. Older than Stonehenge. Older than the pyramids. Older than most known monumental architecture. And suddenly, archaeologists around the world were paying attention. Today, Göbekli Tepe is considered one of the most important archaeological discoveries ever made. It even became a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 2018. But here's the funny thing. Only a small percentage of the hill has been excavated. Something like 5%, which means most of it is still underground, quiet,
Hidden.
patient. There could be dozens more circles down there. Maybe hundreds. Each with their own carvings, their own stories, their own gatherings long forgotten. Archaeology, unfortunately, moves slowly. Very slowly. Careful digging. Documentation. Preservation. It's not exactly the Indiana Jones style of archaeology. There are no dramatic boulder chases. Just careful brushing of dirt. Lots of notes. And people arguing politely about interpretations. For years. Sometimes decades. But that patience is part of what protects sites like this. Because once you excavate something, you can never put it back exactly as it was. So for now, the hill remains mostly silent. Wind moves across the plateau. Visitors walk along wooden pathways above the ancient stones. They look down at pillars carved 10,000 years ago, and they try to imagine the people who stood there, the builders, the carvers, the gatherers, the storytellers, people who lived without cities, without writing, without metal tools, but who still felt something powerful enough to gather together and build monuments, which, in a very calm and sleepy way, tells us something comforting. Humans have always been humans. Even 10,000 years ago, we gathered. We told stories. We carved symbols into stone. We tried to understand the world. And sometimes we built big mysterious structures on hilltops just because they felt important, which is honestly a pretty relatable impulse. And with that quiet thought drifting through the night air, we'll slowly wander a bit deeper into the lingering mysteries of this ancient place. Because the hill still has secrets.
Plenty of them.
Yes, the same one. The quietly mysterious, slightly smug hill known as Göbekli Tepe. By now you can probably picture it pretty clearly. A dry plateau in southeastern Turkey. Low hills rolling off toward the horizon. The modern city of Sanliurfa sitting not too far away. And beneath the soil of that hill, layer after layer of ancient construction. Stone circles. Massive pillars. Carved animals staring out of limestone like silent prehistoric emojis. And archaeologists patiently brushing dust off everything while trying very hard not to panic about how old it all is. Because the deeper they dig, the stranger things get. One of the more interesting discoveries about the site is that it wasn't built all at once, which would have been impressive but also slightly suspicious. Instead, construction happened in phases. The oldest layers, the really ancient ones, date back to around 9,600 BC. And these early structures are the biggest, the most dramatic. Huge circular enclosures. Massive T-shaped pillars rising from the ground. Some over 5 meters tall, each weighing several tons. And remember, this is happening before metal tools, before pottery, before the wheel, before basically every invention we usually associate with complex societies. Yet somehow, these people carved, moved, and arranged enormous stone blocks with remarkable precision, which raises a natural question.
How?
The stone itself actually came from nearby limestone quarries. Very nearby. In fact, archaeologists have found unfinished pillars still sitting in the bedrock around the hill, as if the builders simply walked away mid-project, which is oddly relatable. Anyone who has started a home improvement project and abandoned it halfway through will understand the vibe. But once the pillars were carved, they still had to be moved. And these things were heavy. Some estimates suggest up to 15 or even 20 tons. That's not something you casually toss onto a wheelbarrow. The most likely explanation is fairly simple. Human power. Lots of humans. Teams pulling ropes. Wooden sledges sliding across the ground. Maybe logs used as rollers. Slow progress. Very slow progress. But entirely possible with enough people working together. And once the stones arrived at the construction site, they were carefully placed into prepared sockets in the bedrock, standing upright, sometimes arranged in perfect circles, sometimes aligned with surprising symmetry. Again, all without written plans. No blueprints. No architectural manuals. just knowledge passed from person to person. Now, let's talk about those pillars for a moment, because they're not just plain stone slabs. Many of them are carved with intricate reliefs. Animals appear everywhere. Foxes slinking along the sides. Wild boars charging forward. Snakes twisting around the surface. Birds spreading their wings. Even insects and scorpions show up occasionally. And sometimes the carvings look almost animated, as if the animals are moving across the stone, which is pretty impressive considering the tools available at the time. But the most fascinating pillars are the big central ones, the ones that stand in pairs inside many of the circular enclosures. These pillars are shaped like giant T's, and on some of them, archaeologists notice something strange. Arms. Carved arms, running down the sides of the pillar. Hands clasped across the front, almost like a stylized human figure. Suddenly, the pillars don't look like simple stones anymore. They look like people, or at least symbolic representations of people. Very tall people, very quiet people, people who have been standing there for about 11,000 years. No pressure. Some researchers think these pillars might represent ancestors, or spirits, or gods, or maybe just very important mythical figures. And the carvings on the surrounding stones might tell stories connected to them. But unfortunately, there's one small problem. No writing. Not even close. Writing won't appear in this region for another 6,000 years or so. So we're left guessing, which is both frustrating and oddly peaceful, because sometimes the past refuses to explain itself. And that's okay. Now here's another curious detail. Despite all this massive architecture, archaeologists have found very little evidence that people actually lived at the site. No houses, no cooking hearths, no garbage piles from daily life, which ancient people were actually very good at leaving behind. Humans love trash. We've always loved trash. It's one of our most consistent archaeological signatures. But here, not much, which reinforces the idea that Göbekli Tepe wasn't a settlement. It was a gathering place, a ceremonial center. People came here intentionally, for events, for rituals, for meetings, and then they went home again, wherever home happened to be. One clue supporting this idea comes from the animal bones found at the site. And there are a lot of them. Thousands upon thousands. Most belong to wild animals.
Gazelle.
Wild cattle.
Boars. Deer.
Birds. The kind of animals people hunted rather than farmed. Which suggests something interesting. Large feasts probably happened here. Huge communal meals. Hunters bringing back game. Fires roasting meat. People eating together after long days of work or ceremony. It must have been noisy. Crowded.
Smoky.
Probably smelled like roasted meat and campfire. A prehistoric barbecue festival. Just with more stone carving. And fewer lawn chairs. These gatherings may have been seasonal. Maybe groups arrived during certain times of year. Perhaps during migration seasons when animals were plentiful, or during important celestial events. We don't know for sure, but humans tend to organize gatherings around cycles, seasons, stars, harvests. Even today, we do it. Festivals, holidays, family reunions. We still gather in predictable patterns. Apparently, we've been doing that for at least 11,000 years. And while all this activity was happening at the hill, the wider region was changing too. Around this time, early farming communities began appearing across an area archaeologists call the Fertile Crescent, a broad arc of land stretching through parts of modern-day Turkey, Syria, Iraq, and beyond. Wild wheat and barley grew naturally here, and people gradually learned how to cultivate them, which meant food could become more predictable. Villages started appearing, permanent homes, storage pits, domesticated animals. Human society slowly shifting into a completely new mode of life. But interestingly, the builders of Göbekli Tepe might have existed right on the edge of that transition. Half hunter-gatherer, half early agricultural experimenters, standing at the doorway of civilization without fully stepping through yet. It's like catching humanity mid-upgrade. Version 0.9 right before the big system update. And then, after centuries of activity, something strange happened again. The site was deliberately buried. Layer after layer of soil and debris filled the enclosures. The pillars disappeared underground, and the hill went quiet. No dramatic collapse. No invasion. No fiery destruction. Just careful burial. Almost like someone closing a book, or tucking a memory safely away. For thousands of years, the hills simply sat there. Wind blowing across the grass. Shepherds passing by with their animals. Farmers plowing nearby fields. No one realizing what rested beneath their feet. Until archaeologists finally began uncovering it again in the late 20th century. And suddenly, the hills started talking again. Not loudly, not dramatically, just quietly revealing its story piece by piece, stone by stone, brushstroke by brushstroke. Today, visitors can walk along raised platforms above the excavated circles, looking down at pillars carved long before recorded history. And it's hard not to feel a little humbled, because the people who built this place lived in a world completely different from ours. No cities, no writing, no smartphones, no YouTube history channels helping them fall asleep. But they still gathered. They still told stories. They still built monuments that outlasted them by 10,000 years, which is honestly a pretty impressive long-term project. And the truly wild part? We've probably only uncovered a fraction of the story. Most of the hill is still buried. Waiting, quiet, patient, like it has been for millennia. And archaeologists will continue exploring it slowly, carefully for decades to come. Which means Göbekli Tepe still has many secrets left. And luckily for us, we have plenty of time to drift through those mysteries together. Very slowly, very calmly. The same hill, the one we've been visiting for thousands of words now. Göbekli Tepe, southeastern Turkey, near Şanlıurfa. By this point, your mind is hopefully starting to drift a little, like a feather floating down a calm stream. Perfect. That's exactly the vibe for this part of the story. Because tonight, we're going to think about the people behind the pillars. The hands that carve them, the minds that imagine them, the quiet work that went into something monumental and yet almost completely anonymous. We'll never know their names. Not even one. Not a whisper of a single voice from 9600 BC. But we can imagine them. Slowly. Carefully. Like shadows moving across a hilltop in the warm glow of a campfire. Some were hunters, returning from long days tracking gazelle or wild cattle. Some were carvers, painstakingly shaping limestone with flint tools. Some were storytellers, sitting by the fire while children slept near their feet, recounting myths about foxes, snakes, and other animals that would later appear on stone. Some were elders, overseeing the work and perhaps quietly worrying that the stones might fall or that the group wasn't moving fast enough. And yet, despite all that effort, these people built something that was never meant to be permanent. We already know they buried it. Carefully. Generations of labor, tucked beneath layers of dirt like a dream preserved for the far future. Which, if you think about it, is quietly beautiful. It says something about humans. Something very calm and subtle. We build. We labor. We create meaning. And sometimes we let it go. Some of the pillars show repeated motifs. Animals, abstract symbols, patterns that may have held spiritual or social significance. These were not just decorative. Not just art for art's sake. They were a form of communication. A memory carved in stone. a symbol system that only the participants would fully understand. And the carvings themselves are surprisingly detailed. A fox's tail curls naturally. A snake twists in a realistic coil. Birds spread their wings as if preparing to lift off, all carved with flint chisels by people who had never seen a metal tool. Imagine the patience, the precision, the quiet hours spent shaping stone. Now, here's a thought to drift along with. Every person who touched Göbekli Tepe left something behind. Not in words, not in letters, but in labor, intention, and ritual. The hill is full of those echoes. It's as if the ground remembers their presence. The curves of stone, the impressions of their tools, the placement of bones from communal feasts, all traces of human existence. And these traces are silent. They don't shout. They don't demand attention. They whisper, which is appropriate because maybe that's how history should be experienced sometimes. Slowly, patiently, without urgency. After the enclosures were buried, the hills slept for millennia. Grass grew over it. Animals wandered across it. Humans walked past it without knowing what rested below. And the hill kept its secrets until Klaus Schmidt arrived in the 1990s. Klaus Schmidt, patient, methodical, slightly obsessive, began the slow task of uncovering them. Schmidt described excavating Göbekli Tepe as reading a book written by hands we will never know. And that's exactly what it feels like. Every pillar, every carving, every layer of soil. A story written by people who left no names behind. But perhaps the most fascinating thing about the site is its intentional ambiguity, because it doesn't give easy answers. We don't know exactly what ceremonies were held. We don't know exactly what the animals symbolize. We don't know why the site was buried in such careful stages. We don't know how the knowledge of carving and lifting massive stones was passed from one generation to the next. And yet, the ambiguity itself tells us something. It tells us that early humans were sophisticated, that they could organize, coordinate, and create monumental works, that they had beliefs, rituals, and social structures complex enough to motivate collective labor, and that they could imagine a world bigger than themselves, even if they never wrote it down, even if we will never hear their voices. So the hill waits, waiting for future excavations, waiting for future discoveries, waiting for future generations of humans to stand quietly among the stones and consider the people who came before them. And maybe, in that quiet reflection, something lingers, a sense of connection, a shared human impulse, to gather,
To create.
to leave traces, even if those traces are buried, even if the people themselves are long gone. And with that, we can start to slowly wind down our story. Because Göbekli Tepe is more than an archaeological site. It's a meditation on time, on labor, on the quiet persistence of human effort, and on the gentle, patient way civilization begins, not with dramatic explosions, but with small gatherings, carved stones, and hands willing to work together for something bigger than themselves. So, as you rest tonight, perhaps picture the hill one last time. The massive pillars, the carved animals, the fires of long-extinct gatherings flickering in your mind's eye, the silent hands that built, feasted, and eventually buried the place they loved. And in that quiet, drifting moment, realize that even without names, without writing, without fame, humans have always been storytellers. Some stories take 10,000 years to be uncovered. Some stories are whispered through stone. And some stories, like the hill itself, simply wait patiently for us to notice. And with that gentle thought, we reach the end of our long, slow journey through Göbekli Tepe, a site older than empires, older than writing, older than almost everything we usually study in history. A place that proves the quiet power of gathering, of labor, of imagination, and of patience.
Good night.